1890, the white settlers have had 100 years' experience in dealing with what they call the Aboriginal problem. An aggressive police presence ensures nothing gets in the way of the lucrative cattle industry. But there is resistance. In the Kimberley, a young warrior named Jundamurra leads an uprising against the cattle barons. Jundamurra was never photographed. His status becomes mythical to his people, who believe he has the powers of a clever man or sorcerer. A young girl is determined to simply be herself, despite the red tape that binds her. Intellectually gifted, Gladys Gilligan has an idea or two of her own. This is the story of two individuals. No matter how the authorities tried to constrain them, their spirits were beyond institutional reach. In 1894, Jundamurra is around 19 years old. In his role as native tracker, he guards over 17 prisoners, men and women from his tribe, the Bunuba. They are accused of cattle killing and are soon to be transported to a prison, most likely to their death. Jundamurra sits at a crossroad between two worlds. His best friend is a white man called Richardson, whose life he has saved on 2 occasions. His elder is a man who he loves and trusts. He is amongst the captives. Jundamurra and Constable Richardson guard over the Bunuba prisoners for 7 days. Jundamurra was born in 1873 on one of the first cattle stations established in the Kimberley. He is quickly co-opted into the system.
Jundamurra picked up the skills as a stockman, a drover, a shearer, and very skilled craftsman. He was really very good at things which the manager admired this young man. And he eventually grew up and learned the European way so well.
The station manager was able to boast that he had the best Aboriginal stockman in the district. It was he who taught Jundamurra to use the gun. And like everything else, he mastered it very quickly and became an expert marksman.
At age 15, Jundamurra returns to his people for his initiation. This is carried out under the guidance of Ellamurra, and Jundamurra is introduced to the secret life of the Bunuba male world.
He was getting to know 2 things here. He was getting to know the magic of his own country, and at the same time getting to know the whitefellas. And he was very good at knocking around with the whitefellas. He was noticed very early for being something different.
Ellamurra teaches Jundamurra about the country of his ancestors. He teaches him his law and how to survive, which by this stage includes cattle spearing.
To catch a kangaroo might take 1 or 2 days of continuous hunting. It's much simpler to take one beast at the waterhole, and that will feed an entire group of people for a couple of days. But the consequences of doing so are then discovered to be extraordinarily vicious acts of revenge by the graziers.
during that early period of the late 1800s through to probably around 1910, that's known in the Kimberleys as the killing times.
It is urgently desirable that strong and prompt measures should be taken for the protection of lives and property of the settlers in the Kimberley against the depredations of the natives now becoming alarmingly frequent, which, if unchecked, must eventually lead to guerrilla warfare and regrettable reprisals.
Police stations were the next major investment in the region. Investment in police officers, horses, trackers, magistrates, and entire systems of control of the population through the police force.
Hundreds of Aboriginal men were captured, chained together in long lines, and walked to settlements such as Rottnest.
Rottnest Island Prison is 2,500 kilometres south, an island of incarceration for the first Australians, from which many never return.
Try to imagine the thoughts of one man in one of those chain gangs being walked thousands of kilometres across Western Australia to an almost certain death. It must have been an absolutely terrifying experience.
When the men reached the island and they were taken into the quad, as it was called, it was just this room with no window, door, and no light. And many of them just, I would say, would have just curled up and virtually lost all hope.
I do not like Rottnest. It makes me ill. I've been 2 winters here. I'm cold. My blanket is no good. It is old. I do not know when I'm going back, but I shall be very glad to go. I expect to go by and by. Johnny Widjibidji.
Jundamara is eventually arrested, together with his elder Elamara, and they are jailed for killing sheep. But Jundamara has other plans for himself.
Only served a very short time in the jail. He had the charm and the confidence to basically talk his way out of it. The police allowed him, or the court allowed him, to serve out his prison term in the police quarters looking after their horses.
Jundamara soon earns himself a reputation as a master stockman.
So he was a person that enjoyed his notoriety and then I think enjoyed mastering another world and being recognised for it.
With the arrest of men and large groups of men, it meant that women were generally much more vulnerable to miners, pastoralists, drovers and squatters in the region.
It's very clear that there was violence and rape and sexual assault, but I think also women became free agents, able to wield political power because so many men were killed and the women were the last adults left standing. And women used their ability to move easily between societies as a part of their survival strategy, and I'm sure that they did that in order to ensure that their own people survived.
The The whites cause social chaos by corrupting the existing marriage laws. Jundamara also violates the law, and on the cattle stations has sex with women who are his wrong skin and who are forbidden to him under Bunuba law. His crimes do not come unpunished. He is banished from his people and now lives in exile on the cattle station Lilimalura. The cattle station is situated at the base of the Napier Range. The range is sacred to the Bunuba people, an ancient coral reef filled with a maze of hidden caves and tunnels. It forms a natural barrier, stopping the European land grab in its tracks, much to their frustration. It is at Lilimaluru that Jundamara meets Bill Richardson.
They became close friends, very, very good mates. And later on, Richardson then became Consul Richardson, and Jundamara became his right-hand man. And they were the most outstanding couple in the police force at that time.
By 1894, the Bunuba have destroyed over 4,000 head of sheep.
This was a blatant assault on white occupation, and it was seen as such by the colonisers.
Jundamara and Richardson went to track them down, and Jundamara got them and chained them up and walked them to Lilimaluru. There they were held for nearly 7 days in chain.
The old men start to ask him questions about his complicity with what white people are doing. That is, rounding up family members, people who are related to him. We don't have the evidence of what those old men said to him. They may have made him an offer he couldn't refuse.
And Lilimaluru was also Jundamara's uncle. And he's the one who raised Jundamara. Probably told him, look, I grew you up, I look after you, I cared for you. And here you can see poor Jundamara was caught in two worlds. One with his tribal elder, another was his friend and partner Richardson.
That night, Jundamara makes a difficult decision. He shoots his friend Richardson and sets his elders free. They return to join their families deep in the Napier Range. When news of the killings reaches Derby, a police patrol of 30 men come looking for Jundamara. As the troopers position themselves on the banks below, the Bunuba watch from above. When the elder Elamara is shot and killed, the Bunuba stop firing. Suddenly, at an opening of a cave, Jundamara appears with his rifles blazing. Although badly wounded, he forces the police into retreat and helps over 100 men, women and children escape along the tunnels and passages of the Napier Range.
The fact that Aboriginal people were prepared to stand and fight and had organised and had strategically thought out an ambush was a real shock to West Australians. And that's when the official declaration of war came from the government.
It would be a good time for the West Australian government to shut its eyes and let the settlers up here have a little time to teach the nigger the difference between mine and thine. It would only have to be done once, and once done could easily be forgotten. March 1894, the Derby correspondent to the North West Times.
The reaction from the police is much, much worse than killing one man. It becomes a war.
The European probably thought that we better do something now, otherwise we'll get more people like Janamar.
Just before Christmas, they begin a ruthless journey of bloodshed.
Men, women and children were killed. There was nothing there that symbolises the rule of law. It was simply murder by state action.
Those who survive the carnage are marched into overflowing jails at Wyndham, Derby and Roebourne. Whilst others are sent to the wharves to await transportation. Jundamara sustained his rebellion for 3 years. It took one of his own, a black tracker, to finally hunt him down. He was shot, decapitated, and his head sent to England in a jar.
Janamar is always will be a hero for the Bunga people. Doesn't matter how people see it as good or bad, but he'll always be a hero, the one who more like a freedom fighter.
With the last armed resistance defeated, the first Australians are left powerless for what is to come.
It becomes clear on the evidence that the core group of people who are being made more and more vulnerable within that region were Aboriginal women. At the same time, these files record an increasing number of children of mixed descent. Now, sometimes, from oral testimony of people who I've spoken to, who are alive at that time, these were through liaisons that people had chosen. For the large part, the stories that people tell, though, are of abuse of Aboriginal women, are of rape.
The rising numbers of children from these liaisons are an embarrassment to civilised society down south.
This is a breach of the code of racial hygiene, and the children of such unions must be removed, both from the black races, who they would pollute, and also from the white race, who they would also pollute.
There was a saying, God created the white man, God created the black man, and the devil created the half-caste.
In 1922, Gladys Gilligan, a 7-year-old girl, is labelled a half-caste as her mother is black and her father is white. She is taken from a cattle station up north and dropped off at Moore River Native Settlement, thousands of kilometres to the south.
You bring in the children, take them from their families, teach them basic 3Rs and some training in domestic service or in farm labouring work, and over time they would blend into the community.
Gladys is issued a number, 489, and like thousands of others, a file is created for her which will now control her life.
The girl's name is Gladys Gilligan, and she is a pleasing and well-mannered youngster, and should well repay any effort on her education and training. A.O. Neville, Chief Protector.
I have this fair-skinned lass here, who, if trained properly, will be a great asset to the wider society. And that, in doing so, it will be money spent well. To me, that is just like a meat market.
It was a kind of concentration camp, a way in which to remove people from non-Indigenous society and congregate people in one place, out of sight and out of mind.
Gladys manages to get a letter out to her white father. He writes back.
Dear Tom, just a line, as I promised to send some money to Gilligan. I got a letter from her last night and am closing a cheque for Gilligan, as I don't know her address. Will you kindly send it on and oblige? There's no news out this way, so with kind regards to yourself and Mrs. Woodland, yours faithfully, G.L. Frenose.
The Chief Protector, Mr. Neville, intercepts the letter and writes back to him.
You signed yourself as her affectionate father, so I think I am entitled to ask what the position is and whether you are really her father or not. You may not be aware that there is a clause in the Aborigines Act which provides that the fathers of half-caste children shall be responsible for their maintenance at a government institution. The amount payable to date would have been approximately £186. A.O. Neville.
Dear sir, I would like you to understand that I do not claim to be the father of the child and state that I definitely am not. The child was on Mullabula when I was working there, and I did become fond of her. The £10 I sent her as a present, I never did claim to be her father.
Neville puts a stop to any further communication from Gladys to her father. Mr. Neville, a well-to-do gentleman, is the Chief Protector of the Aborigines Department. His job is to oversee the reserves and solve the Aboriginal problem.
And you'd march in. As you entered the door, you looked up on the wall, and there was this huge portrait of Mr. Neville. I knew he was a very important man. I don't know why. I didn't know why. I suppose I thought later he might have been a benefactor.
Mr. Neville was an English migrant, and his dad was a rector, so he had no experience of working with Aboriginal people.
He wields his power through the 1905 Act. It is intended to protect and care for the first Australians, and it gives Neville total power over their lives.
It's not a kindly, charitable, evangelistic act that's embodied in this idea of protection. It's the idea that, well, the natives are going to die out anyway, and so to make it more convenient for them and more convenient for us, let's segregate them from our colonial outposts so that we can just get on with it and let them die peacefully over there.
There was no thought for the mothers. The constant comments were, oh, they'll get over it, they do. It was almost treating Aboriginal mothers as subhumans without any thought. And yet, on the other hand, some of the police, the protectors of natives, in my file, particularly one police officer in my file, wrote twice to say that my mother was looking after me and didn't think it was necessary to remove me, and then gets instructed to do it.
The mechanism by which the 1905 Act was executed was through the police force.
The police come thundering in their horses, and they're looking for half-caste children. So there's this great flurry and crisis and fear.
I didn't know what to do. I kept running, and the police kept bringing me back. They put me in a cell in Laverton that time. Yeah, there are about 8 or 9 of us kids, all tied up.
My own grandmother was born in the Kimberley region during the killing times. I've tried to imagine what it must have been like finding yourself on a police escort walking 150 miles where she was housed with people who were chained at the neck, with other children who'd been taken away from other stations.
I was about 5 or 6 when they took me away. I remember that day when the police came. My mother, she just stood there. I could see her crying, just standing there. I'll never see her again.
And the mothers had no rights at all, no rights to protest or anything. All they could do was sit down and cry.
Neville arrives at Moore River to personally check on progress. His visit sparks a flurry of activity.
We slept on coconut hair mattresses and were given one government issue blanket. The only time we had sheets on the beds was when there were visitors from Perth, and then they'll rush around making the beds up with sheets and Snow White pillow slips. So as soon as the car was out of sight, they'd go and take them off and pack them away for the next time.
At Moore River, he meets the young Gladys Gilligan. Neville asks her to write him a letter.
The settlement lies on the bank of Moore River. The hills surrounding it, making it look quite a pleasant little home. Every morning the girls and boys get up at 6:30. When breakfast is over, the children play until it's time to have their hair combed. The matron sees to that. At 8:30 the sewing bell rings and the girls go to the workroom. Then at 9 the school bells ring and the children come skipping along, chattering and laughing from all directions. Dinner is ready at 12. Grace is said, and they sit down and have dinner. During the summer seasons, the girls and boys often go swimming and fishing. At Saddle Hill, the beautiful Geraldton wax plant grows. It looks beautiful when in full bloom. Everybody here appreciates the goodness of the government and Chief Protector in providing food and clothing. Gladys Gilligan.
We were locked up each night from 6 o'clock in the evening till 6 o'clock in the morning. And it had a specific effect on my life. Years later, growing up,
I mean, a child could hurt themselves, but the missionary won't show any kind of affection at all. So it was cold, kind of upbringing. I mean, they all preached and believed in God, you know, and Jesus loved all little children and so on. That's what we were taught. But you had no affection at all in that place. You worked. You were child labourers.
We were raised as white. And we didn't know anything about our customs or our culture.
The mission taught that, you know, your culture was evil, and those who practiced it were devil worshippers, pagans. The first time I discovered that my father was a black man, a Murdu man. And you know, all these thoughts were going around in my head as I put my arm around my father. And I was still wondering, you know, is he a devil worshipper? And then I felt these warm tears fall on my head. I said, no, he's not. He's my father. This is my dad. You know?
Neville's obsession with colour is behind the establishment of a new institution known as Sister Kate's, where he sends children who are fair-skinned.
It was a procedure of Neville's to what he called pick out the lightest. I was the very first person put there in 1934.
I had a white father. There was 11 of us. I was the only one taken. I'm taken from Mount James Station. I'm put on a truck with a policeman. Then I'm driven a couple of 100 k's to Meekatharra. And then I'm handed over, and this is all in my file, see? Then I'm handed over to a stranger. And she and I travel the 2 days on the train to Perth. And then the next day driven out to Sister Kate's. And I'm 4. And I've got a grandson who's 4, and I'm trying to think what would happen to Tommy, you know, if that had happened to him. I can't imagine. 2 weeks after I was taken away, my Uncle Tony wrote and asked could he have me. He had acknowledged that he would disown his own family, and he was working on stations. And they even then said, no, she can't be brought up with natives.
My dad lived for 11 years after I was put there, and I never ever knew that he existed. And conversely, he was never allowed past that gate.
Gladys is now 16 and has spent 10 years at Moore River. She is a promising student, so Neville arranges for her to be sent to Perth to attend high school. She is accommodated at a home established by Neville called the Native and Half-Caste Home, where all his wards are forced to stay in Perth, and where Neville can continue to oversee every detail of her daily life.
Gladys says that she hopes to teach in Sunday school every Sunday, and that she is in the choir. May I point out that I have not been consulted in either case. A.O. Neville, Chief Protector of Aborigines, 2nd of November 1931.
Dear Sir, I was quite under the impression that you knew Gladys attended church and all places in connection with the church.
While I have no objection at all to Gladys attending church, Gladys is susceptible to influence of various kinds, and I do want her to understand that she is in Perth to work and acquit herself favourably for the occupation she is
sir. I beg to report Gladys has grown out of her 2 winter dresses and her overcoat. She also requires
Before supplying Gladys Gilligan with the things for which you ask, I would like to have another report as to her conduct and progress. It is not worth spending money on this girl unless she is going to profit by the training she's getting. A.O. Neville.
Yes, it's good to train them, like a puppy dog, when they're small. But they become very, very independent after reaching adulthood, and that's what Mum was like. She always had that independence.
Dear sir, I beg to report that Gladys Gilligan disappeared from the home in the early hours of March 9th, taking all her clothes and school books.
Gladys escapes into the night, but Mr. Neville's control extends into the streets of Perth.
Now, White City was kind of a carnival on the banks of the Swan River, and in the 1920s, Aboriginal men and women would go to White City, ironically, as a place of enjoyment. Mr. Neville heard about Aboriginal people visiting there and did not like the idea of Aboriginal men and women meeting up with non-Aboriginal men, but also with other Aboriginal men without his intervention or control.
Quite a number of young half-castes have been frequenting White City and its vicinity. Also, a number of half-caste girls have been parading the streets. A.O. Neville to the Commissioner of Police, 1927.
Mr. Neville gave instruction to the police to stop Aboriginal people visiting White City. In 1927, Mr. Neville created the Perth Prohibited Area, essentially 5 kilometres square. After 6 p.m, you had to be out of the prohibited area of Perth if you were Aboriginal. Very soon after, that regulation was used to create prohibited areas right across the state.
To the Commissioner of Police. Herewith, please find the warrant covering the arrest and removal to Moore River native settlement of a half-caste deemed to be an Aborigine named Gladys Gilligan. Until last night, an inmate of the native girls' home at East Perth. A.O. Neville.
Gladys is arrested and sent back to Moore River.
Moore River was set up to accommodate 200 people. During the 1930s, at the height of the Depression, there were over 500 people there, so conditions there became appalling.
Of the 500 people buried in the Moore River Native Settlement Cemetery, over half of them are children under the age of 5. Most of those children died of preventable illnesses and diseases.
Gladys is back where she started. There is no indication when and if she can leave.
To the Chief Protector of Aborigines, Perth. I have to report the following birth at 8:40 p.m. on Saturday last. To Gladys Gilligan, number 489, a son, and his index number is 1405. Superintendent Neil.
Dear Sir, would you kindly permit me to have Frank Morgan's address? It breaks my heart to think he denied being the father of my baby. If I could write to him personally and explain things, he will understand better.
I have seen your child several times and cannot bring myself to believe that he is the son of a white British subject. It appears to me his father was either a half-caste, or at least a person of colour.
My baby may be dark-skinned, but that does not mean to say that he hasn't a white father. Colour does not count by any means. What matters? Why recall the past? It is the future I am looking forward to.
But to Neville, colour is everything. Neville refuses to give Gladys the father's address. Her firstborn son is taken away from her.
What Australia's half-caste daughters need is their own mothers who love them, and their own homes among their own people, and teaching until such a time as they shall have attained legal and economic and political freedom and meet white people on terms of equality. Mary Bennett.
Mr. Neville met one of his worst nightmares, Mary Montgomery Bennett. Mary Bennett was independently wealthy, she was very intelligent, she was a feminist, she was outspoken, and she attacked Mr. Neville on numerous occasions for the policies that he was advocating for the department. She particularly criticised what she called the official smashing up of Aboriginal families that Mr. Neville supported.
Many of these poor children are parted from their mothers, but first, for years, they suffer the misery of hunted animals. Always running away from the police, always in fear that at any moment they may be torn away, never to see them again. Mary Bennett.
Mary Bennett takes her battle one step further against Neville. She is instrumental in forcing a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the welfare of the First Australians.
Mary Bennett went toe-to-toe with Mr. Neville. Mr. Neville was there. He sat in on all the hearings almost as a co-commissioner with Moseley, who was the Chief Magistrate. The Moseley Royal Commission visited Moore River. Moseley said that it described Moore River as a woeful spectacle. He reported that the expenditure on each inmate, as they were called, was 1/6 of the expenditure on prisoners in Fremantle Jail. 1/6.
Despite the evidence, Neville's powers are increased. His legal guardianship of Aboriginal people is extended from the age of 16 up to 21.
One man's so-called dream, or whatever it was, it turned out to be a nightmare, really, for many of the wards of the state at that time, which of course I grew up to be as a ward of the state when I was 21. I've spent the rest of my life in institutions.
If we're wondering whether the public was aware of the treatment of Aboriginal people under Mr. Neville's regime, well, the fact is that he was implementing the policies that the public wanted him to implement. That everyone knew where the Aboriginal people had gone to. It was not a secret. The debates about policy and legislation, the Moseley Royal Commission, all of these things were reported in the press. The big question is, did they care?
Neville goes on to promote his breeding out policies at a conference of Australia's Aboriginal protectors from every state of the country.
Are we going to have a population of 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth, or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there were ever any Aborigines in Australia? A.O. Neville.
Their sole purpose of assimilating people was to change them, to change their race, to change their culture, to change their language, to change their practices of living with other people, to change their religion. Now, what is that? That is genocide. And it's against international law for that to happen, and yet Australia was practising it with a smile on their faces.
Moore River is handed over to missionaries to manage in 1951 as a cost-cutting exercise. The adults are ordered to leave. Only the children remain. Gladys seeks permission from Mr. Neville to be married.
Aboriginal people had to get permission to get married. 3 times they approached the Protectorate. 3 times it was knocked back, refused. So they went and did their own thing. They went and saw this Church of England minister in Gingin, it's a little township about 90 to 100 kilometres out of Perth, and explained the situation. And he said, yes, I'll do it. So he went ahead and married them in 1938. He could have been up for a huge fine, it could have been jailed. Apparently his words were, and I've got them on record, say, if 2 people are in love and they want to get married, I will marry them. You know, I thought that was a really great thing that Mum and Dad, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And the most vivid memory I have of my mother, and she had this beautiful blue frock. It was the fashion of the day. The black hat, black gloves, and black shoes. And I could see her walking up the garden path.
Gladys dies in 1941 after a long illness, at only 29 years of age. Between 1910 and 1970, an estimated 50,000 Aboriginal children are removed from their families. Most are aged under 5.
So if you can imagine that you've been removed from your own country, either as a family group or as an individual, you've found yourself imprisoned either in a compound or existing in a camp, you're unable to leave that particular place, you're not allowed to go out to earn your own keep, and on average 2 to 3 people are dying every month. In that way, I think it can only be seen as an unhealthy government experiment.
I was 24 when I met my mother in Meekatharra, north of Perth. I had 4 children. We travelled by train from Geraldton and we arrived at dawn on Christmas Eve in 1963. There was an old granny that I knew at Moore River. She said, your mother is down there. She pointed to these tin huts. She said, oh, you know her. She's the only half-caste one there. So I lugged my suitcase, baby in the arm, 3 others walking along beside me. I nervously kind of touched her shoulder. I said, excuse me. She opened her eyes and looked at me. I said, do you know me? She shook her head. And I had a big lump in my throat there. I didn't know what to say, whether continue. But then I did. I swallowed and I said, touched her again. Do you know me? She didn't say anything. She just looked at the kids. No? My grandchildren, she said. My daughter. And everybody was rising up and coming over crying.
Evidence mounts of the profound trauma caused by the forcible removal of thousands of children. Yet the government resisted acknowledging this human rights abuse until 2008.
Mr. Speaker, today we honour the Indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians.
I missed out on over 30 years of birthdays, weddings, funerals, all that. I have no concept of all those sort of things.
We apologise, especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country.
I never saw Mum after that. Matter of fact, I didn't even know what she looked like.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations.
She was just so happy that I never blamed her, and that was all that she was worried about. And I said, no, Mum, I never blamed you. I know what the government did. It wasn't your fault.
We say sorry.